t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show where we zoom in on some of the stories in the news this week, hear what's at stake for you and of course for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Well, coming up this week, countdown to COP28. Not long now until world leaders gather to confront major climate questions. But here in Brussels, the business sector is nervous. The EU is finalising green finance rules that would make companies responsible for their environmental impact and human rights. With the European economy still jittery, we're looking at Europe's challenge to stay competitive whilst protecting the planet and, of course, workers' rights. And MEPs backed a draft EU law this week that would combat online child abuse. The new rules that will be put to a vote in the European Parliament soon will determine when and how the web can be scanned for child sexual abuse materials. With reports from the Council of Europe that 1 in 5 children are targeted online, we're asking if the European Union can find the balance between protecting our children without infringing on our privacy. A warm welcome to our guests this week. Elizabeth Kuipper, Associate Director with the European Policy Centre.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. Michiel Hooghaven, Dutch MEP with the European Conservatives and Reformists.
Good to be here.
And Isabel Schumann, the Deputy Secretary General of ETUC, that's the European Trade Union Confederation.
Thanks for having me too.
Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. But just before we hear your views, let's just remind our viewers what exactly EU ambassadors have been chewing over this week.
Respect the planet and human rights when scaling up. The European Commission's message to big business as EU capitals mull new due diligence regulations. Companies with over 500 employees could soon be obliged to uphold environmental protection measures and labour rights. Victims would even be able to take companies to court. NGOs welcome the move as a step towards a fairer economy and a better growth model. Critics, however, warn that the rules could kill Europe's competitiveness. With politicians on edge ahead of European parliamentary elections next year, we ask if the EU will ever manage to balance social responsibility with economic growth.
Now, this draft corporate sustainability due diligence directive was put forward by the Commission back in February 2020. Next week, there'll be trilogues in Strasbourg. The aim, of course, is to get it done before the elections. Elizabeth, perhaps we start with you. Have you been following this directive and what is your take on it?
Well, absolutely. I think everyone in Brussels have to follow this directive. I think it's very, very important also in the geopolitical context that we're dealing in. And I think in that respect, we don't have a choice but to make it a reality. And I know that from a business perspective, there have been a lot of opinions as to whether or not this regulation is leading to too much red tape and to what extent it's good for Europe's competitiveness. But I would argue that we don't have a choice and also that businesses don't have a choice. Because we already see that climate change is impacting their business. It's leading to a loss of crops. It's leading to, we have all seen the floods and the wildfires. And we have seen, for example, in Italy, the hailstorms, where you even hear that in terms of insurance, it's affect how business operate. So I think we have to make it a reality. And also from a global perspective, we need to ensure that this is not just a European approach, but also really more following a global agenda, because the EU needs to get other parts of the world behind in order indeed for companies to have a global level playing field.
Well, especially if the EU wants to go to COP28 in Dubai in just a couple of weeks and preach that it is actually implementing what it's preaching on the global stage. But, Michiel, as a politician there, would you agree what Elizabeth Kuipper says there, is that you do not have a choice?
Well, I've been in Europe in the European Union for some years now, and what I really see in these institutions is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that is, I mean, the initial goals of these kinds of regulation is indeed to create a more just, sustainable, friendly world. But the consequences are for businesses to take. And if I see what a barrage of rules and regulation has been coming from Brussels to our businesses, to our corporate sectors, on audit, on finance, on fiscal policies, on climate policies, gender policies, equal work, equal pay, it all has to do with compliance. It all has to businesses have to comply with these rules and regulations. They have to report, they have to hire consultants, they have to hire audit firms, they have to hire law firms.
And that's why you're calling it the road to hell. Well, let's hear from ETUC's perspective here, the trade union's perspective. I think, Isabel, you've been following this directive for many years.
Yeah, we've been very much engaged in the whole discussions on the corporate sustainability due diligence, which should have been a responsible business conduct on human rights, the very first title. And I think we are very much on board to make sure that this initiative delivers, hopefully at the end of this year, in terms of having sustainable business and fair competition around, indeed, the respect of human rights, the respect of the environment and the respect of people on this planet.
Well, look, everyone has a view on it, and it certainly caused a stir here in Brussels as well. And this week, protesters inflated a gigantic Lady Justice in the European quarter to draw attention to the high stakes around these negotiations. Civil society, environmental groups and NGOs have been waiting for this for many, many years. Did anyone catch a glimpse of Lady Justice there? She's been on tour. She's been in 7 different European countries, I believe, and Brussels was her last place to be. Did you catch a glimpse of her?
I saw her, and I think it's really good, and I hope that she continues to be touring, because I think it is really important that people indeed get to terms and also learn about the challenges at stake. And in that respect, it's really interesting what Michiel just brought up. I think the big issue here is that sustainability is often dealt with in silos. And that's indeed why you have a lot of different indicators and scoreboards. And I think indeed, if we go to an approach that is much more holistic in nature, we at the European Policy Centre indeed say we need to go to a well-being approach where you don't also and only measure, for example, GDP when it comes to economic progression. But you also need to take into account health and the environment, labour conditions, everything that the regulation is speaking about. And I think then if you have a much more of a holistic understanding, it hopefully also leads to a much easier way of measuring what you want to see in terms of outcomes.
Well, that's a whole other debate. I mean, and we saw this week the economic forecast for autumn was presented as well by the European Commission. The Commission's still very much looking into its figures based on GDP to reflect how the economy is doing. But Isabel, as I said, you were among those protesters from ETUC, and there was a lot of other actives there. And I wanted to ask them what exactly they hope to achieve with this Lady Justice. Let's just take a listen.
We're here because Lady Justice could be stabbed in the back by the Council today. If the financial sector is not included under obligation to do due diligence on their investments, and if corporations don't have to cut their carbon emissions, then Lady Justice is stabbed in the back. That means on the ground is that corporations continue to emit while everyone else suffers the consequences.
Because the financial sector is so prescriptive for the economy, including on climate. They are one of the primary financiers of the fossil fuel industry. They are essentially bankrolling the climate crisis today.
So NGOs and environmental groups, they're furious that a number of EU countries want to exclude financial services from the directive. You were nodding along with what you heard there. What more can you tell us on that?
Yeah, of course, I think it's not just excluding the finance sector, it's of course taking aside the responsibility of businesses, the accountability of businesses when looking into downgrading the issue of civil liability of businesses. It's also looking into the issue of allowing business to do business, exploiting workers, exploiting the planet, exploiting the communities around the operations of businesses. And it is not acceptable. This is not a sustainable business model. This is not what we want in Europe for more social justice. And exactly that was the message of these demonstrations. Justice has to be part of what business have to respect. And there is no business outside legislation. So I think here the Europe is showing the way forward. And I think this is important that on the basis of existing national legislation in France, in Germany, we have the possibility to bring this up to Europe and to indeed build on those, I would say, baseline, and to provide even more for Europe so that Europe shows the way forward what should be sustainable business and a sustainable economy.
Michiel, you used to work in the bank, right? So
Yes.
you know exactly what it's like to work in the bank and to make money. And would you agree with these reports that the NGOs have been presenting, saying that the world's biggest fossil fuel extraction projects are operated and funded, in fact, by many banks, many French banks?
What I really miss in this discussion is what it means for the entrepreneurs on the ground. These kinds of regulations that they need to comply to, that they need to hire consultants. I was with a cheesemaker in the Netherlands, so a very, very typical company. It only had like 50 employees. And he was really telling me in desperation, I have to spend 50,000 euros a year just to comply with reporting from rules and regulations coming towards me. The European Commission once promised a one-in, one-out principle. So one rule or regulation comes in, one goes out. They haven't adhered to this. We are destroying our small and medium-sized business sectors. And by also targeting the financial sector, I mean the big evil financial sector, these are the main financiers of small and medium-sized businesses. So we should be very careful by throwing these kinds of rules and regulations to our businesses.
Quick reaction from you, because obviously this week in Brussels a lot of people have been reporting and speaking about the fact that the financial sector could be left out. What's your take?
Well, I think we see in the financial sector that discussion is taking place, and that also there indeed priorities are being widened and broadened up. And I think we also know that banks indeed are doing projects also taking into account climate change. And I think that is very important because we have to shift our mindset when it comes to investments. And again, taking into account climate, but also more social factors such as employment. I mean, we're living in what we call the twin digital and green transition. I think a lot of people, and I think also in SMEs, indeed face the fact that they're faced with a lot of different skills that are needed. So we need upskilling and reskilling. And oftentimes, and classically, I think as a banker, you know, that these are seen as costs. We need to see them as investment in future generations of people and the planet.
And the European Central Bank, for their part, weren't too happy about that. They said there could be penalties for companies who do not comply. But Michiel, you said what was missing from our discussion today was the element of how business is feeling all across Europe. But we did check in with business because I don't know if you noticed, but this week 700 business representatives from all across the continent and beyond were here in Brussels. They were in the European Parliament. In fact, they took over the chamber. The event was called the European Parliament of Enterprises, it was run by Eurochambre, so Eurochambers, and they're the eyes and ears, of course, of business all across the continent. They're presided by the Czech economist Vladimir Dlouhy. And of course, Michiel, I was curious to hear his perspective as well on this directive, so let's take a listen.
Well, to put it simply, we are afraid of it. There is no doubt. If I talk to the German, Spanish, Czech entrepreneur, they say, what does it mean? Does it mean that when I import something from, I don't know, from outside European Union, from the Arab country, and then there is a sub-supplier from China, and the Chinese sub-supplier has somebody from Indonesia, shall I be responsible for the whole supply chain that I might be even made criminal liable in my country within the European Union, that the fourth sub-supplier is violating the rules? We are shooting ourselves into our own foot with this type of not properly prepared regulations.
So Vladimir Dlouhy there saying he's afraid of the directive. He's worried that the EU is shooting itself in the foot. Perhaps, as you've been studying this directive for many years, you know, give him some clarity there on how supply chains will work and what message he will have to communicate really to his representatives over in Germany and Spain who do not understand how this directive will work.
I think instead of having fear, I think we should be very proud of having such a directive. And I don't really get the message we don't know our suppliers. I think every spare part produced outside the European Union or even inside by suppliers are known, and even there is a quality control of every spare part of a product, a car, for example. And this is known by any employers that this quality control takes place. So if you can do that, how far your supplier is, why can't you do that for working conditions of this exactly spare part of a product or a services? And I think here this is where the message does not fit really with the situations in practice. We can very well know how a product is produced. And here this is a responsibility of businesses to be well aware that if you exploit people to produce cheaper product, this is not acceptable anymore. And this is a clear message we have to send.
So should we then as consumers get ready to pay more perhaps for our products? IKEA, for example, is one of the members of Eurochambre.
Well, I think that's indeed a fair debate to have, and that's why it's so important to educate people so that they become aware why it's so important, especially in a world where we have seen and still see that indeed we are dependent on other parts of the world, which leads also to unwanted consequences, and also the fact that indeed, and I think I made a point earlier, a green Europe only makes sense in a decarbonizing world, because it's a fair point that we oftentimes say that SMEs are the backbone of the European economy. But then indeed also for SMEs, it means that indeed if they export to other parts of the world, they should not indeed be hampered by red tape because of the fact that other parts of the world are lagging behind. And that's why indeed the European Union also needs to make it a global effort to work on the green agenda, because otherwise there's imbalances, and that is something that needs to be avoided.
And Michiel, I saw this week the European Roundtable, so CEOs from Mercedes, L'Oreal, Heineken, also putting out a statement saying that they're feeling pessimistic, saying that they're pessimistic about the short-term recovery in Europe, that complex, quote, incoherent regulation is a risk to EU's competitiveness. But as Elizabeth Quipper pointed out earlier, there's so much at stake for the climate. We're on our way into these talks at COP28. I mean, how can you find a balance? It's the question I feel we're asking every week between making sure this continent is competitive, but also fulfilling obligations to protect the planet and people.
Well, I'm not just worried about the climate, but also on our investment climate, our business climate. And I think the representative said it very well, that businesses feel afraid. They feel afraid because they are basically treated as a danger unless proven otherwise. I work on the forced labor ban. Of course, nobody is in favor of importing products that have been made by the hands of forced labor. Nobody is in favor of that, and also businesses are not in favor of that. But now we are starting to treat businesses as guilty until proven otherwise. And not only that, it will also cause, and I think your question was very much correct there, this will also increase prices of products. We're already facing inflation. I mean, for the middle class, this is really something that will add up to the cost of living again.
So time is... Brief comment?
Yeah, well, very briefly, because, I mean, it's true, but on the other hand, consumers also want to have more transparency. They want to know more. For example, a very simple example. If you buy your clothes, you want to know where they're made, if they're made sustainable. And at least you want to have a choice about what you're buying. And if you just don't know because there's no information, what can you do? And I think there, again, it's about education, and consumers want to have more transparency. So it's a good thing that we should use.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Next week, as I said, there will be trialogues taking place in Strasbourg, so we'll keep you updated. But also just an update on certain trialogues that ended just last week on the nature restoration law. Did you follow that? Final text is finally on the table, albeit perhaps a little watered down. A lot of flexibility. Michiel, are you in agreement with the final text that was agreed on?
Well, I think that the nature restoration law has been something that we have been very much against. You probably remember the farming protests that we saw in the Netherlands. We see a housing crisis in the Netherlands. We see infrastructure is put on hold, building infrastructure. And that's not because of the nature restoration law, but because of the Birds and Habitats Directive. And the nature restoration law is basically a Birds and Habitat Directive on steroids. So we're now facing a nitrogen crisis 2.0 in the Netherlands. So this nature restoration law, while it's diluted a bit, we're still very much against it.
Still very much against it. What about yourself as well?
No, I think it is a very important achievement in Europe, and I would like to say that businesses need to comply. And what we have seen, and this is also one of the bases of the due diligence legislation, is actually when you have the possibility to comply with voluntary guidelines. The evaluation in Germany before the German law was that only 17% of the businesses that were claiming compliance with the guidelines did that. 17%. It's really not acceptable that on one side there are guidelines to be complied with and business claim that, and at the end of the day, when we evaluate that, we see that it's not the reality. And we have to move from the voluntary dimensions towards something which is the level playing field for all. And I think this is the basis for fair competition.
And we've only seen, of course, that binding targets work. But also we've seen over the last couple of months just how divisive all these various topics are. On glyphosate as well this week, Elizabeth Quipper, we saw member states not able to take a decision on whether to extend or not the allowing glyphosate to be used. So in the end, the European Commission had to take the matter into its own hands.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're referring to the fact that indeed initially the French president had indeed mentioned and committed to indeed banning glyphosate, and he came back on that decision. And for me, and also coming back to the nature restoration law, that's really a sign that indeed election time is about to start, because we all know that in June next year we have elections. And whereas some political parties in the European Parliament had initially chosen much more of a nuanced approach, I felt already before the summer break, when all of this started, that indeed the polarization is used for political purposes. What I really hope, because again, I feel that we don't have a choice, is indeed that this wouldn't lead to much more polarization, but hopefully to more collaboration. Because again, we have one planet and we need to preserve it.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have to stop you there, but we will keep you posted on how those talks go on that directive. But stay with us, because after the break, we'll be switching gears and talking about how members of the European Parliament hope to combat child sex abuse online. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with Elizabeth Quipper, Michiel Hooghaven and Isabel Schumann, we're taking a look at some of the stories in the news this week. And one item that caught our attention was a vote in the European Parliament Civil Liberties Committee to combat child abuse online. 51 MEPs voted in favour, 2 against, and just 1 MEP abstained. With online grooming spreading at an alarming rate across Europe, MEPs in Strasbourg will need to endorse their final position soon. Verna McGowan, that's the director of the Centre for Democracy and Technology, has been following this closely and told me how the dossier was marred in controversy.
The original draft had unfortunately made provisions to allow law enforcement and social media companies scan everyone's messages, even if you were innocent and had nothing to do with the crime, in order to scan some of these photos. What the European Parliament Libe's committee has done is that they've introduced really clear limitations and safeguards on detection orders, and they have also really made very clear distinction between the EU centre that would be looking into the technical approach in these photos and law enforcement. Sometimes there has been a false dichotomy here that it is child protection on one hand, privacy on the other. That's actually a dangerous and incorrect narrative, because the most vulnerable children are those whose privacy rights also need to be protected.
Verna McGowan there from the Centre for Democracy and Technology, but it looks like a more balanced draft law was agreed on. Elizabeth, did you follow this?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's a really important topic, especially given all the dangers of the online world that we're living in. I think there's a lot of disinformation and discussion how to tackle it. So indeed, online child abuse is very important. I think the issue here is indeed, and I think we saw that indeed, that we need to strike a balance between a proposal that perhaps avoids ending up with a sort of surveillance society where a lot of indeed innocent citizens are being targeted, and perhaps also then missing the goal of online child abuse. And I think that is very important indeed in the final proposal, that we strike that balance and that we also perhaps look at other measures on how to indeed effectively tackle online child abuse.
And I think that's what MEPs want, in fact, that only a judge would be able to order the scanning of private communications. Michiel?
Yes, well, I think that the European Parliament did a very good job here. Indeed, the balance between, on the one hand, privacy and on the one hand, countering child abusive content, which obviously is very important to tackle. But we don't want to end up in a mass surveillance sphere. And if you, the original text, if I'm correctly, stated that it would also be possible even to scan and screen end-to-end encrypted messages. Well, we also have a right of secrecy of correspondence. That's actually in the Human Rights Charter of the European Union. So I really think that the European Parliament did a very good job by balancing this regulation a bit better.
And of course, this is just the start of the process. It will have to go to what we call trialogues again. There'll be discussions with the member states. The plan as well, Isabel, is to have an EU body based, I think, in The Hague. I've seen that would be in charge of this, helping EU member states implement. But do you think we need even an EU law here? Because shouldn't it be also local and national governments and authorities that should be cracking down even more, as we've seen this problem spike in the last few years?
No, I think this is a very important initiative and a legal one, and I think we also here need to have a legal framework, in particular because its digital playground is not safe. And I think here we know the damage of child abuse material online. I think we really have to stop that, and I think we're a bit late already in terms of legislating. It's very important that we take that step, and it's important that also the member states move forward. And the European Parliament here again has managed to strike a balance, a difficult one. We understand, of course, we should not go into mass surveillance. On the other hand, we have to protect the children. And here, a product which is a digital product online, which is not safe, in principle, what we should do in the European Union is to apply the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is to protect the one who is the victim of this product.
And the statistics are frightening. I've seen 2 pictures Our videos of child sexual abuse materials are seemingly published online every single second, and Meta seemingly disabled more than 490,000 accounts for violating child safety policies this year alone. But just to get the perspective from child rights groups, because they were not actually too pleased, Michiel, with this text from the European Parliament. I saw 80 organisations and survivors are worried that the regulation could eliminate the ability for platforms to voluntarily detect for online child abuse. And for more on what it's like to actually be a survivor of child abuse, Euronews' Mairead Jones spoke to Rhiannon Faye MacDonald from the Marie Collins Foundation. She was abused when she was just 13 years old.
After a few hours, they had gained my trust, and they were complimenting me and saying lots of nice things about me, and they convinced me to send some photos of myself, which were quite normal. That quickly changed, and they asked me for a topless photo. They convinced me that it was okay. They used that photo to threaten me and to blackmail me. Perpetrator came to my home the following morning, sexually abused me in my bedroom, and took more photos. And then I didn't speak about this for a very long time. I suffered with anxiety, panic attacks daily, depression, self-harm, 2 suicide attempts.
Rhiannon Faye MacDonald there, a survivor of abuse, and now using her voice very bravely to raise awareness. And her demand is clear: detect and remove any content so that she can walk around with her head up high and know that she won't be recognised. So you can see a lot at stake for Rhiannon and other survivors there. It's not an easy file, this one.
No, absolutely. I think we all agree that this is terrible. And again, it has an impact for the rest of someone's life. And I think to the point about how and at what level we can tackle this, I think it goes beyond the national perspective, because today's world is an online world. And for example, at the European Policy Centre, we have been looking indeed also on disinformation, indeed what you can do also with platforms involved, perhaps with the use of multi-stakeholder coalitions, where indeed you also have like media experts, but also clearly psychological help. Perhaps also because foresight is very important to see what can happen and indeed what scenarios may happen that we can anticipate on. And I think there's different ways of looking at it, but clearly I think a mix of building up what the European Parliament has been doing this week, but also coming up indeed in addition to that, I think with methods that lead to more education as well, also when it comes to parents, because they may not always be aware of what their children are doing and where they're ending up with. And I think that element of education is equally important.
Indeed, Elizabeth Quipper, education extremely important, but also proper legislation. That's what survivor groups want, to protect their privacy, which means focusing on detecting and also removing content. Well, we'll certainly keep a very close eye on how those votes go and see if that text gets the European Parliament's stamp of approval. But I'm afraid that is all we have time for on this topic. As I said, we will return to it. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekend show. I'm Maeve McMahon. Now, one story we're watching very closely here takes us next door to the Netherlands, where millions of people are getting ready to vote and to go to the polls. After 13 years in power, it's the end of an era for the outgoing Prime Minister Mark Rutte, known locally, I believe, as Mr. Normal, for his simple lifestyle. For more on the nail-biting election, here's an update from our correspondent in The Hague, Fernanda van Tetz.
Elections just a few days away here in the Netherlands, with many voters still unsure of who to vote for. The issues that have been dominating this election cycle have been the housing crisis, as well as healthcare, the cost of living and inflation and migration. Now, there's a record 26 parties running for seats in Parliament, the building just behind me. 3 parties are looking to come out on top. One is the New Social Contract, a new party started by MP Pieter Omtzigt. He's managing to draw voters from the right and the left, as well as new voters. Then we've got diligence, who could become the first female Prime Minister of the Netherlands, leading the VVD, the party currently in power, the party of Mark Rutte. And then we've got Frans Timmermans, the former Euro Commissioner, who's hoping to bring the left back to power for the first time in 2 decades. So a very exciting time ahead. We'll know the results on Wednesday.
Fernanda van Tetz there. Michiel, is it a very exciting Time for you?
Well, indeed, it's an end of an era, as you said, that Prime Minister Mark Rutte has left. So there's a whole new political landscape now. And what we see indeed is that we have a consolidation, especially on the left, with Frans Timmermans running to become the next Prime Minister. But what's also interesting is that we see that the party of Mark Rutte, which used to be a center-right party, has very much become a centrist party in favor of more big government, more power to EU, quite soft on migration. And then we have the far right, which was not mentioned, that is Geert Wilders. And there's something in between, and that's my party. So we're very much in favor of small government, strong on migration and strong on the European Union.
Okay, you got your plug out there. Another Dutch lady around the table with us, Elizabeth Quipper. What is at stake here for Brussels? Is Brussels keeping a close eye on this election?
Well, absolutely, as it should, because I think the Netherlands always prides itself of being the biggest of the smaller member states and the smaller of the biggest member states. So it's this crucial position in the middle, as they say. So in that respect, I think what will happen in the Netherlands will be picked up in Brussels. On the other hand, and I think Michiel and I were discussing that at two Dutchmen, the EU is not really playing much of a role in the campaign. I think also only Peter Omtzigt indeed is mentioning sometimes the need for an opt-out on migration, but that's really about it, which is in a way perhaps surprising because Frans Timmermans is Mr. Europe, but he's perhaps choosing not to be involved in that discussion on the EU because he really keeps to more local matters.
More local. And what about Ituk? Are you keeping an eye on those elections?
Of course, very important that the democratic forces make the difference in these discussions and in these elections. For us, it is important that ahead of these elections, it is a clear message that there is no way back to austerity. I think we heard that the cost of living is a really important concern of the populations, and of course, linked to that, there need to be investment in the people and in society, in the planet, and I think Frans Timmermans is well placed to make that happen. Indeed.
But the question is he more popular outside of the Netherlands, Frans Timmermans? I mean, he's very known on the global stage, but inside, if he's liked, we will find out on Wednesday. But we've a couple of seconds left to go before we wrap up, but just tell us more about this new kid on the block, Peter Omtzigt. Can you help me pronounce? Yeah.
He's pretty much of an interesting guy. He's a former Christian Democrat, but he is also quite critical on the European Union, the expansion of the European Union, the financiering of the finance of the European Union, so the Eurobonds, common debt. He's very critical on that. But on the other hand, he's still very much a Christian Democrat, so still also very much in favor of big government, big EU.
We will keep a very close eye on that. They're happening on Wednesday. Euronews reporters will, of course, be on the ground, so stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you so much to our guests, Elizabeth Quipper, Michiel Hoogheven, and of course, Isabel Schumann. Thank you so much for coming, for being with us. And thank you for watching. Any comments on anything you have heard today, please reach out. Our email is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. We're also on Instagram, on Twitter and LinkedIn. See you soon, though, on Euronews.